Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar about the consultation we're running on the RICS Rules of Conduct and Statement of Ethical Principles. I'm delighted to have so many of you joining us. I realise that some people seem to have got the link very late. I know Abby is busy sending out links, and so we'll hopefully have more people joining us as we go along. My name is Chrissy O'Rourke. I'm the Head of Conduct Standards for RICS. That means that I work in the standards department, and my responsibility is the standards that are to do with professional conduct. So not technically how people do surveying, but how they behave as professionals. And that's why I'm running this project on behalf of RICS to look at updating the rules of conduct. We have a really great panel with us today, two chartered surveyors and Antony, who has done a wealth of regulatory work, and they're going to help us to consider the changes that we're proposing, how we think that they'll affect surveyors, give you an opportunity to ask us some questions, and hopefully help you to frame some comments that you can make on the consultation to help us to get this document right. You can ask us questions by typing them into the questions box on your screen. Please do that, and we'll feed those through. We'll take as many as we can at the end of the webinar, but if we don't get to any, we will make sure that they're all fed in, and if we can give you feedback on those outside the webinar, we'll do that. The webinar is also being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out with the email that you get after this, and that will also include the link to how you participate in the consultation. To start with, before we get onto the panel discussion, I realise that not everybody will have had a chance to go and have a look at the proposals in the website, so I'm going to give what I hope is a really very quick just introduction to what we're proposing so that you have some context for our discussion. I'm just going to share my screen with my presentation on it. So I'm hoping you can all see that. So, as I said, what we're consulting on is a document that we have that we've published, which sets out a proposed new rules of conduct and statement of ethical principles for RICS, and that would apply to all members and all firms. In the proposed document, we've put the rules for both members and firms into a single document. We're asking questions about how that works for you. Also on the website where you can find that document, you'll find a consultation document which explains some of the reasoning behind why we've made some changes or why we're suggesting making changes, and also the questions that we're asking as part of the consultation. We obviously have some questions that we're keen to hear from you about, but you're also free to make any comments that you would like on any part of the document. We're very keen to hear any suggestions that you have. The consultation is open until the 7th of December. Assuming at that point we feel that we've had enough engagement, we've heard enough comments, we would then consider all of the comments that we've got, put them together to go to the Standards and Regulation Board, and if changes are adopted, those would probably be published sort of late spring next year, probably to go into effect in the summer of next year. But that all obviously depends on us getting comments and understanding what the effect of these proposed changes will be on the profession and on the users of the profession. What we're proposing is a document which contains 5 rules. Those of you who are familiar with the global ethical principles will recognise that structure. And what the document proposes doing is, rather than having separate rules of conduct and global ethical principles, a single document that combines the both. The rules themselves will be the mandatory content. Those will be the parts of the document that we would use if we were taking disciplinary action or investigating complaints, and those are the requirements. But as part of the document, we've also provided example behaviours, which really is to help to describe and clarify for members, clients, firms, what we mean by some of the concepts in the rules. So how a firm or a member might demonstrate that they were meeting the rules. They're not exhaustive, they're not prescriptive, they're not intended to be extra rules. What they're intended to do is help to clarify what do we mean by some of those concepts like acting with integrity or giving a good service that might be a little difficult to define otherwise. The most important thing to say is that obviously being a professional involves the exercise of professional judgment. It would be impossible for us to write a rule book which covered all of the complex situations that a professional faces in practice. What we want this document to do is to provide something that you can use to think about the situation you're in, use your professional judgment, draw analogies to think about what would good ethical practice look like in the circumstance I'm in. The rules of conduct that we are suggesting are firstly, that members must be honest, act with integrity, comply with professional obligations. Secondly, that they must maintain professional competence and ensure that services are provided by competent individuals, providing good quality and diligent service to clients, treating others with respect, and acting in the public interest, taking responsibility for their actions, maintaining public confidence in the profession. Like I say, most of those concepts I think will be familiar to people either from the existing rules of conduct or from the global ethical principles. I thought it might be helpful to share a rule with its behaviours, so you've got some context, some understanding of what we mean when we talk about behaviours. So this is Rule 4. Members and firms must treat others with respect. So that's the mandatory section. As you can see, it's quite short. And then the behaviours that we're suggesting under that really dig into what that might mean a bit. So not discriminating against others, not bullying or harassing them, thinking about supply chains that you're in control of and making sure that they aren't exploiting people, reporting abusive labour practices, working well with others, and encouraging diversity and inclusion. So these aren't extra rules, but those are examples of the ways that we think that somebody treating others with respect is likely to behave. And obviously they're not necessarily going to be relevant to everybody. Not everybody is going to be in control of a supply chain, for example, but those of you who are, we think that that's one of the things that somebody treating others with respect would be concerned about. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Hopefully that was helpful in just having an idea of what we're proposing if you haven't had a chance to go and look yourself. And now I'm going to introduce our brilliant panelists. Really pleased to be joined by two chartered surveyors, both of whom are passionate about promoting the surveying profession, attracting and retaining surveyors, particularly those from perhaps non-traditional or underrepresented backgrounds, and both of whom also run their own firms, which I think is really useful and interesting as a perspective for people who I know might be worried about how these rules might affect their firms. So we've got Dayle Bayliss with us. Dayle is a fellow of RICS. She's a former member of Governing Council and she's a trustee of Lionheart, which is the charity for RICS members, which is doing a huge amount of amazing work during the pandemic, supporting members and their families. She runs her own practice, which exercises her collaborative approach to construction projects, and she does a lot of work tackling the challenges of skills and diversity in construction. She's a member of the NALEP Skills Advisory Panel and the Skills Lead for the Construction Sector Group Building Growth, and she's also a member of the Construction Panel for the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. We also have with us Bola Abisogun, OBE, who is also a fellow of RICS, and he's a member of the London Regional RICS Board. He's also a qualified APC assessor, and he established the first RICS network for BAME surveyors, diversity surveyors, and in 2010 he was appointed as chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission's Construction Leadership and Diversity Forum. He's the founder of Bayliss, a professional construction and project management firm. Bola also chairs Moving On Up, a multi-million pound employer engagement initiative covering 3 sectors, including construction. We're going to start with our panelist Antony Townsend, who is the chair of the Conduct and Competence Working Group that drafted these proposed changes. And I'm going to start by asking Antony just to share his thoughts on why we're proposing the changes.
Thank you very much indeed, Chrissy. And I thought I would introduce myself by saying that it's just coming up to 30 years ago that I was taken to a court in the southwest of England charged with attempted murder. And the reason that I was charged with attempted murder was because I was trying to prevent a very dangerous doctor from practicing on the medical register in the United Kingdom. And he decided to charge me with attempted murder. In actual fact, he'd just been released from a prison sentence for grievous bodily harm. And the reason I was involved in that was because I was regulating doctors. And since then, I've regulated dentists, I've regulated solicitors, I've regulated accountants, and most importantly, I've regulated chartered surveyors, because for 6 years I was chair of the UK and Ireland Regulatory Board of RICS and a member of the Global Regulatory Board. And I have to make a confession, which is that over those 6 years, I developed rather an affection for chartered surveyors, which perhaps you don't often hear, but I very much have enjoyed my time working with chartered surveyors, and I was very pleased to be asked to chair this working group on the revised code of conduct, which we're asking for your views on. I wanted just to say a few things really about why professionals have codes of conduct at all, because I think it's worth remembering that. As professionals, you have a set of knowledge and skills that the people for whom you do work don't have. You're in a position of power. And some of your clients, many of your clients, are vulnerable because you hold that knowledge, you have that power, and they don't. And that's why organisations like the RICS exist, because they're there to assure the public that the professional they employ is properly qualified and of good character. And so part of the system for surveyors requires that each member of RICS can be held accountable. Now, in my view, having worked with lots of professional groups, the best possible safeguard for any client is the conscience and competence of the individual surveyor. That is the bedrock, really, of all professions. Where that conduct or competence is called into question, we have to have a measurement. Surveyors are good at measurement, something to measure that competence and conduct against. And the code of conduct is simply the public statement against which each individual member can be called to account if that's what's needed. Now, building upon what Chrissy said, I think the first thing I want to say is that if you are a conscientious, competent surveyor, if you treat your colleagues and clients and others with respect, if you're honest and trustworthy in all your dealings, I can guarantee that this new code is not going to change your life. If you're already doing all those things, this code is there to support that. It might be there to guide you, but it is not fundamentally changing what being a professional surveyor is. Being conscientious, being competent, being respectful to others, and being honest really have been the trademarks of chartered surveyors over a very long period. So this code of conduct is not tearing everything up and starting completely from scratch, but it is making some changes. And I wanted just to run through some of the reasons why we think making changes is a good idea. First of all, as Chrissy mentioned, currently there are at least 2 documents, in fact quite a complex network of documents from RICS. And in particular, there's the international framework, and then we have the code of conduct and ethical requirements. And it seemed to us that having a single code combining ethical principles and rules was going to be better for everybody, better for individual surveyors wanting to do the right thing, better also for members of the public if they want to find out what they can expect from a surveyor. The second thing to say is that over many, many years, the RICS has grown from being a Victorian, male-dominated, ethnically homogeneous UK body into an international body with a diverse membership and with members operating in a huge variety of environments, and also within a system of an international system of ethics. Third thing to say is that in surveying, like in nearly all other professions, there's been a growing focus on maintaining and developing competence. The old idea that if you got your entry qualification, you were fine, even if it was obtained decades ago, that idea really no longer, I think, holds. Members of the public, indeed fellow professionals, expect people to maintain and develop their competence. A fourth thing, ethical issues, some ethical issues remain the same, others the emphasis changes, and I've mentioned two particular things. One is equality, diversity and human rights. There is a much bigger focus on that, and professional groups, like other groups in society, have a duty to play their part. And the other big issue in surveying, sustainability. How do surveyors deal with the issues of sustainability? And then finally, in undertaking this work, we've taken account of the fact that the regulators in other professions have developed new approaches to codes of conduct, and we've been able to learn from those. So all of those factors we think are important reasons why we might want to revise our approach to the code of conduct. So what we've tried to do, putting it simply, is we've tried to produce a document which is reasonably short so that it can be easily read and can be used, but it's very clear up front about the fundamentals, and Chrissy has shown you the 5 core rules, the core principles against which members can, if necessary, be measured. And then finally, we've tried to make it helpful without being over prescriptive. And Chrissy has mentioned the examples of behaviour which come under each of the rules. As she said, they're not supposed to be prescriptive, they're not supposed to be exhaustive. And ultimately, worth emphasising, it has to be for you as an individual surveyor, taking into account of all circumstances to make your own judgment. So the example behaviours don't tell you exactly what to do. There will be circumstances in which you may want to do something else, but ultimately, if you were called to account, you would need to be able to explain why the way in which you behave is consistent with the rule. So finally, just really to sum up from me, no rules of conduct can provide answers to all situations. As a professional, like in all professions, you will sometimes be faced with difficult decisions about how to balance your client's requirements with the public interest. We can't answer all those questions for you, but we have tried to produce principles to help guide you. And part of the price of having the privileges of a profession is that you may be required to justify your conduct. But in return, you have the right to expect from RICS that your conduct will be judged fairly against public principles and with the full regard to the context of your behaviour. So we hope that our draft code of conduct is helpful and clear and enables you to practice in the ethical and competent way that I'm sure you all wish to behave. But we are very open to have your feedback, both on the approach we've taken and also any particular issues where you may feel we've got the drafting wrong. And we shall, of course, be taking all of that back at the end of the consultation process and then making whatever revisions are required. Thank you very much, Chrissy.
Thanks, Anthony. Dayle, Antony mentioned the fact that one of the things that the working group, which you were also on, was trying to think about in how it drafted the rules were the challenges arising from climate change and the increasing concern for sustainability in a lot of different professional practices, but obviously particularly in the built environment. And you very kindly agreed to give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm just following on really from what Antony sort of set up, that where we were to where we are now has evolved, and it's about time that we updated what us as surveyors are working to reflect that. And I think what sustainability is one of those things. I know when I first started out, it was very much about carbon use, those terms: reduce, reuse, recycle. But sustainability has moved on a huge amount. It's about the whole life of a building. It's the impact that we as surveyors have within the communities and the built environment in which we work. So we've tried to establish something that sits aside that, but is also something that pushes what we do as a profession, so that we are seen as leaders in sustainability. So as part of that framework, we've worked and sort of looked at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they capture that much broader definition of what sustainability is. So it's health, well-being, equality, what is clean energy, responsible consumption and production. They're all within that, and I think they're all things that us as professionals, we should have in our conscious mind when we are advising our clients and working in our day jobs. And that's not to say not all projects can kind of reach that gold standard of sustainability, but we have a duty to advise to the best we can and keep pushing those boundaries. I think we have to be conscious of what public perception is on energy consumption and sustainability within the built environment. A recent RICS survey through YouGov, public said that 65% of those surveyed felt that construction industry bodies should be doing more to tackle climate change, and 55% of those surveyed said that property and construction sector had a negative impact on the environment. And they're really shocking perceptions of what it is that the built environment is. And some of that is that it's not actually true. We do a huge amount in that area, and so we have a lot to do to change perceptions. But the RICS and us as professionals are there in that thought leadership role on pushing what sustainability is. And so I think that's what we've done, is try to incorporate what it is that we're doing in the day job, but set that in a framework that has those behaviours that are achievable, but also aspirational. Because I think as surveyors, we are leaders in our profession, and as chartered surveyors, we're recognised for being leaders in our professions, and therefore we should have something that shares that aspiration, drives that thought leadership, and really reflects what it is for us as a profession.
Thanks, Dayle. That's really helpful. If people go into the consultation document on the website, you'll be able to see we've picked out some of that information, and you'll be able to see which of the behaviours we think reflects some of the challenges around sustainability and comment on them. Bola, you weren't a member of the working group, so I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on the document. And in particular, obviously, we think it's really important that one of the changes we're proposing is, although respect has been part of the global ethical principles, it's now becoming a rule. And one of the reasons for doing that is because we very strongly want to support and help drive diversity and inclusion in the profession. And I'm interested in your views as to whether you think that that's something which this change might help with.
Well, first of all, Christine, thank you for the kind invitation, and really just building off of the eloquent points made by my colleagues Antony and Dayle. So I want to contextualize my contribution really by kind of giving a backdrop as to why the respect agenda with regards the rules of conduct are so important. So I'll quickly take you back to 1999, the year that I qualified as a PQS, and why the rules at that time were much more prescriptive and less subjective. I think that's pretty much my position at the moment, that the new rules are a complete game changer for all intents and purposes to where we were 20 years ago. But at that time, in 99, I mean, I qualified graduated in 94, qualified in 99, and I decided to leave the profession, the corporate side of the profession, largely because respect at that time wasn't great. So, you know, there is some irony now that I find myself 20 years later now extolling the benefits of what mutual respect really means, what it means to develop professionals, you know, but then like others, I'm here to serve. So my view is that we are still very much an overtly confident profession, which is great. You know, we think and we know that we're great technicians. You know, we're trained to master a process, we're trained to master workflows, but that doesn't necessarily make you a great people person. And I think at the crux of your particular reference to we must treat others with respect, that's what it comes down to. Now, knowing how others feel, knowing how others relate to you, your every word, knowing when you've crossed the line, got it wrong, is of equal importance to me, and should be for every other chartered surveyor, as to really understanding how to caveat your client-facing report. You know, the two go hand in hand. And it's a daily requirement. This isn't just something that you have to do on good or bad days, or when you've got to submit a document. You've got to embrace respect and respect for difference as a professional. And really just building on what Antony was saying, and to your point about the bullet points you raised in your introduction, I wanted to pick up on two of those bullet points. Firstly, 4.4, which talks about supply chains and supply chains that are free from exploitation. And of course, that whole canopy of language experience rings true with me insofar as my lived experience around being in supply chains. And I'm really talking about consultant supply chains. But what do we mean by exploitation? You know, it hasn't been defined. I don't think it can be defined. I think it's to your point about language and conduct. But we really do need to understand that if, as individuals, we detect exploitation, would we call it out as professionals? And that's a question that applies to all of us, and I'm putting it out there. I'm challenging my fellow professionals around their ability to recognize and stamp out exploitation in supply chains, within reason, of course. The second point I wanted to pick up on was the fact that there's an aspiration now for members of firms to act in a way that encourages diversity and inclusion. And funnily enough, the question that often comes back to me is, well, what does that mean? You know, what does it look like? What does success look like in many ways? And I think, again, thankfully, the ground zero position for me that I often refer to people is the RICS APC competency on diversity, inclusion, and team working. And you know, therein lies a process map, if you want to call it that, around understanding what those issues really mean and could look like from a practitioner's perspective. But I really want to engage in the conversation. So in summary, I really wanted to challenge the profession and challenge everyone listening on 2 points. Firstly, that we need to think about what emotional intelligence means to each and every one of us. And we need to think about how we can develop and refine our emotional intelligence as professionals. We're great technicians, that's a given. But we are not great when it comes, in my opinion at least, to emotional intelligence and how we deal with each other. And we really need to figure that one out ourselves, but largely through conversation. And in many ways, those conversations might be challenging. And to the second challenge, and this is really dependent on us getting the first challenge right. So we improve our emotional intelligence, and then we can start thinking about how can we offer and develop more culturally competent professional services. And I say that to say this, in that, you know, post-COVID, we're now in global virtual world, and our clients are coming from all corners of the world. And we need to understand that actually in giving a great service and understanding that we can be measured and monitored on that, we need to understand that we need to really think about difference. We need to think about our design teams, the way our clients engage, the way our clients commission, and what our clients expect as part of that commission. And because we are a people business, we really need to take a deep dive and a greater look as to how perhaps we think about how we treat each other. So the respect agenda isn't as prescriptive as perhaps maybe one would have liked. But the point is, in order for us to be better professionals, more holistic professionals, we've got to figure out a way of understanding that we can only grow once we respect each other in a different way. And putting our technical skill set to one side will then reveal how much work we really need to do on ourselves as individuals. And I think, there are amazing people in this profession, but there are also some people that need to really do some work.
Thanks, Bola. Those are really interesting challenges, and I have to say, coming from the background I do, where I dealt with complaints for a very long time, including at RICS, it is the thing that makes that causes a lot of complaints, is that emotional intelligence, that ability to engage properly with clients. You may have done a great technical job, but if you haven't really engaged well with clients, that's often where the root of a lot of the problems comes from, particularly those very avoidable complaints that people deal with. I'm going to move us on now to some questions. We've had a few in the question box. Do please post more. We're very happy to take questions on anything. I'm going to start with one that Peter Scott's posted. What he basically says is the scheme sort of suggests it will rely heavily on social ethical standards as well as technical surveying standards. He makes the point that these vary greatly and asks on what specific definition of social and ethical standards will the RICS judge its members, those of President Trump or Pope Francis? Antony, I'm going to look at you because that seems like a you kind of a question.
I rather feared you were going to do that, Chrissy. This is a difficult question, and it's a classic dilemma in regulatory context, even in the courts, actually. If you look at the 5 rules of conduct, they are actually, making some moral points, really, particularly treating other people with respect and acting in the public interest. They're very broad concepts, but they are actually fundamentally ethical values. And the inevitable question, which Peter Scott is quite rightly asking, is how do you judge those? And there are two ways of approaching that. One is to judge it by the standard of other ethical competent people, and that's kind of how the courts approach these matters, and it's how an RICS tribunal would approach these matters. I think it's important to remember that the ultimately, the backstop of these rules of conduct are disciplinary proceedings, and those are only taken, in the really more extreme cases. It's not that every member of RICS is going to be quizzed on treating others with respect once a year. So there is a backstop position, and then ultimately it's for the tribunal, which is a mixture of surveyors and non-surveyors, to decide whether or not in the circumstances an appropriate standard has been met, bearing in mind that this is against the question not of are you a saint, but are you somebody who should be allowed to remain in the profession? So that's the standard. So I think that's my first slightly legalistic response. I think the second response is to say that the rules of conduct are not only for use in the extreme position of a disciplinary tribunal, they're also designed to encourage people to think and talk within their professional settings about what being a good chartered surveyor means. And that goes straight back to Bola's point. It's great that you've got the technical skills, and it's very important you have those technical skills. But if in fact you're not respecting your colleagues. If you're not respecting your clients, you're not doing a good job just because you're technically okay. So there isn't a neat answer. I think what experience shows, not only in RICS but in a wide range of tribunals, is tribunals can and do grapple with these points, and they're not looking for sainthood, but they are looking for ethical behaviour.
Thanks, Anthony. We've had a question, I suppose similar questions from Clive Woodford and David Hugel, sorry, I may be pronouncing your surname incorrectly, which are really about what are the differences with what we currently have and whether it's possible to give some examples of rule changes and reasoning. Now, obviously, that would be, a lot of the detail on that is in the consultation documents. But Dayle, I wondered if I could just ask you, I mean, particularly, I suppose, from the context of running a small business, are there things here that you think are very different, or that you think it's important for people to maybe look at when they're thinking about responding to the consultation?
I don't think it's hugely different. It's, we as chartered surveyors practice in the same way. What it is doing is bringing in, like Bola has said, diversity and respect, and just bringing us up to date, because they're older. The world has moved on since the last set was released, and it's also about, I know it says a question, I think it was from Stanley Chow, about current guidance and the mandatory competencies and what we're proposing. This is about, for many of us, the times that we look at the rules is when we pass our APC and we never go back to them. And as a small business owner, that's the reality. It's the same as when you sign the contracts on a project, you put them in the drawer, you never look at it. It's only when things go wrong do you pull those out. And this is about having behaviours embedded, so that actually when you get those times when you think, I'm not quite sure, and I think in a small business it's me and my husband, there's not that kind of ability to kind of bat things around, just check, are we doing it right? But actually having behaviours is a really practical tool to kind of just navigate through some of those difficult situations, so that it isn't just something that you look at when it's gone wrong or when you're doing your APC. So broadly, it's not hugely different. The way in which it's structured, I think, is the huge difference. That it's simplified. It's not going from many documents to see where the right answer might lie. And it's also about those behaviours. I think that's the real core difference, that you can kind of think, okay, yeah, that's how I would navigate through this situation.
Thanks, Dayle. There's a question from Errol Brandy, who says, in relation to inclusion, have any outside bodies been asked for input to the consultation on the rules of conduct? I mean, Errol, we have very strongly reached out to organisations like Bola's organisation, DiverseCity Surveyors, some of the other representative groups that represent underrepresented groups within the surveying profession. So Freehold, for example, we've asked to participate in the consultation, and a number of other groups. I mean, Bola, maybe I can just ask you the question: do you think that who do you think it would be really important for me to engage with in this consultation to make sure that we've really understood whether we've met the mark here?
But I think because the question is asking about inclusion, that should address all strands of diversity, if we're talking about diversity, and whether we're talking specifically about ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation, it depends. But I think you have been quite collaborative in reaching out to those other groups, and the feedback from those groups, I know, is being embedded into the proposed document. So I think we can answer Errol's question quite confidently in that it's a yes. If you want a list of who those bodies are, I think you're in a position to give that information, perhaps, Chrissy. But I would say that, you know, what I'm already detecting through this conversation is pretty much my initial concern, if I can call it that, in that these new rules are less prescriptive and in many ways could be interpreted in many different ways. And there's a value in that. But because we are introducing at a higher level a requirement for better behavior, which cannot be prescribed, the challenge is going to come around how members perhaps think they may fall foul of the new rules, rather than whether or not they can embrace the new rules. I think that the new rules are clearly no different in content or impact from what was once before, but clearly there's an opportunity now to allow members to maybe think a little bit deeper about their own actions, their own behaviors, their own biases, and their own workflows. But this isn't just about the technical competence, because, you know, as a chartered surveyor, the one thing you can assume quite rightly is you are great at what you do. In fact, let's park that and let's look at you as a human being. And I think that's the general gist here, the transition or the pivot, for want of a current used expression, is that we're going from one of huge prescription to one of less prescription but more common sense and emotional intelligence. This is about you now becoming a better individual and a better professional by the way you behave, because we're going to assume that technically you are top of your game. Now that kind of new scenario, I think, is what is teasing some of these questions. And it's the reason why I've referred them to the APC competency, because I think that's a great ground zero to get a better perspective about actually what does this all mean regarding behaviors. And I think, to Dale's point, many of us, and myself excluded, do not look at the APC, but, you know, I'm an assessor, so I have to. And I've been inspired by what we put in that document, but I know that my fellow peers are not referring to it because they're qualified. So unless and until we almost introduce a reverse engineered requirement, actually you need to take a look at this every year, or whatever the case is as part of CPD, perhaps, people are not going to understand the crux of what we're really doing here. And all we are doing is reshaping a very prescriptive at one time document into more of a, let's have a conversation about what it means to be a chartered surveyor, whether you're GP, evaluation, BS, QS, whatever, that's all fine. But as a person and as an individual, and how do you engage with the public? This is about language now. And this is why I refer to emotional intelligence. So I hope we've addressed Errol's question, but I think I'm already seeing one of the concerns that was likely to happen, in that perhaps it's not technical enough, it's not prescriptive enough. And as scientists and as technicians, we do need workflow. We need process maps to say, right, turn left, turn right, do this, do that, you get the right outcome. Without that, it's so much more subjective. And I'm already seeing that coming through some of the questions. But it's great. This is what we were asking for, right? So we've got to find a way to embed all of this concern, if it is concern, into the new document, in my view.
Thanks, Bola. I think that also perhaps points up the fact that, you know, one of the things that I think definitely needs thinking about around this is sort of the supporting material around it. So obviously there will still be technical standards for particular areas of work, but one of the things that I find really useful, particularly when I'm talking to people about ethics, are sort of case studies and sort of worked examples and things like that. And I think there's definitely some work that we could do around the, if we adopt the new rules to try and provide more of that. There's a question here from Caroline Foot, and a sort of similar question from somebody anonymous, who asking really about, you know, although chartered surveyors must obviously do the best job possible for their client, it shouldn't be at the cost of disrespect to or bullying of any other party. And that's obviously one of the reasons for the behaviours being drafted in the way that they are. And Caroline says she'd be interested to hear anything on how the rules of conduct will be enforced, or how lack of respect or bullying, for example, can be reported and dealt with satisfactorily. Antony, I mean, you and I both, as kind of having worked for a long time in complaints handling and regulation, will know that this is a particularly difficult area. And I wondered if you could take a first stab at just answering that for me.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. This is a very difficult area, but partly because people feel inhibited from complaining. So I think, I mean, looking in the RICS context, the first thing is that RICS is placing responsibilities on firms as employers, as well as upon individual surveyors to deal with bullying and harassment. So in some contexts, the RICS may be asking the firm to explain how it's dealing with alleged bullying and harassment. And clearly, if you can deal with bullying and harassment locally, that's the best way. That's the best way of dealing with it. The question which then arises is, what happens if the local mechanism, for whatever reason, isn't appropriate? And ultimately, what these rules are saying is that bullying and harassment are potentially sufficiently serious to call into question the membership of an individual surveyor for gross examples of bullying and harassment. If I can just sort of draw a parallel, there's quite an interesting parallel with the way that doctors are regulated. It was said in the old days that doctors would be struck off the medical register if they had an adulterous affair with somebody in their town, but they could harass their nurses as much as they liked and no one would take any notice. It's completely the reverse now, and the General Medical Council does take action against gross examples of bullying in the work context. I think what this document is signalling is that if you are a bully and a harasser, you are not a good chartered surveyor, and ultimately that is something for which you may be held to account by the RICS as a body, and that actually does mean RICS being brave enough to take some quite difficult cases. But it's very clear in these rules and in the way the behaviours are drafted that this duty not to bully and harass and exploit people applies to your colleagues, your clients, but actually more broadly as well, and that's deliberate. And as I think one of the questions in the chat that I saw said, you do have a sort of fundamental ethical duty even to the people on the other side. In other words, you're acting for a client, that just because the client's interests might make you want to lie to the other side or behave badly to them, that's not good enough. You do have fundamental duties, ethical duties to everybody, not simply in the context of your contract.
Thanks, Anthony. I think there's also something in what Bola was saying earlier about this being about not just about being a tool for enforcement, but hopefully something that people embrace and use in the context of thinking about their behaviour and how they can improve and become excellent surveyors. So
yeah.
I think that it's a very blunt instrument for enforcement, but hopefully it has other uses as well. There's a really excellent question from Tara, who is talking about the fact that there may be a number of people in the profession with neurodiversity, such as autism, and that might affect, the nature of the difference may be around people skills and potentially communication. And she was asking how would such a characteristic be viewed in a complaint situation, and whether sort of neurodiversity will also be part of inclusivity within the RICS. I mean, I suppose just to start with, to say very clearly that if a complaint is made against a surveyor, RICS absolutely recognises its responsibilities under Disability Discrimination Act and just generally the responsibility to be fair to people. The important point is, have you given a good service to your client? That would be what we'd be looking at, and obviously we'd be interested in in whatever effect a neurodiverse difference might have on perhaps how someone is perceived or how that might have come across, and that would absolutely be taken into account. But Dayle, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on kind of inclusivity for neurodiverse people.
I think even with challenges in the way in which you approach your work, you still have that inbuilt respect, even if sometimes the way that you communicate that is challenging. And I think most people on the receiving end understand that. It's when that behavior crosses over into that territory of bullying. And so it's not necessarily how you communicate, it's what you're communicating in the way in which you behave, because for like autism and those kind of, they're the things that make you. So that's a personality and a characteristic, and this is not what this is trying. It's not trying to change you as a person. It's just about having that kind of more diverse and inclusiveness in your thought process, and just making sure that you do respect people. So I think, kind of coupled with the way the RICS approaches any kind of disciplinary or complaints, that it shouldn't be an issue.
Thanks, Dayle. Bola, did you want to add anything, or do you feel that we've covered?
I think you have. I think you've done, collectively really well. And some of these questions are absolutely amazing. And to Tara's point, she's right. It's going to become more normal, if I may say that. And I think, generally most professions are really looking at what neurodiversity really means. It's one of those things that we've all potentially taken for granted in some way, but in the context of a complaint scenario, that's going to be really, really important. And again, it comes back again to subjectivity, etc., evidence perhaps, and then there's perception of the facts and what the facts really mean. So again, if as practitioners we're open and honest with ourselves, we'll allow people to declare those kinds of characteristics very early on and take them into consideration in a positive way. And similarly, where we're meeting members of the public who have a characteristic that needs to be protected, we need to recognize that very quickly too. So otherwise complaints can just snowball from nowhere to somewhere, almost without a source of origin, because we just didn't see it. So I think, again, it comes back to how can we learn to be better individuals? We're great technicians, and I think the rules really aren't alerting us to that requirement now. What the new rules are saying is, we know you're great, we want you to be better, and we want you to be better people managers, for want of a better word, and engagers. So the whole language of what difference means, difference in speech marks, it could mean anything, but you've got to recognize it and embrace it. So it's a great question, but I'm hoping we don't enter that foray of complaint where neurodiversity becomes a real issue. But and just picking up on very quickly, I've seen Uche Obi. He's also picked up on the fact that the diversity and inclusion APC competencies level 1, should it be level 3? I'm not going to offer my opinion. I think we need to do something in that space. Thankfully, Graham Watts, OBE, again, he's picked up another question. Great, Bola suggests ethical test. I hope they don't hang me for it. But the point is, I think we need to do something. This is the area of our skill set, rightly or wrongly, that perhaps we don't spend enough time on. We're so trying to stay ahead of the curve technically, as we need to be, but the soft skills also need to be considered in the wider context of what that toolkit really looks like for a great surveyor. So I'm glad that there's a theme around behaviors emerging slowly. So yeah, I think the message is beginning to translate, which is great.
Thanks, Bola. I would say that the whole sort of qualification piece is definitely something that we know that some of this stuff needs to follow through into, and we're taking that up internally. I just really quickly want to mention Keith Thomas raised a question about what was happening to some of the quite specific requirements around things like doing CPD, having professional indemnity insurance. They do remain in the document. There's a very short list of professional obligations. So you might remember way back at the start of the webinar, we talked about part of Rule 1 being complying with professional obligations. There is a short list of those in the document, which include things like doing your CPD, having appropriate professional indemnity insurance if you're a regulated firm, things like that. So that hasn't been lost. That is there. Antony, could I just ask you, there's a question from Lalu Jayardi, again, apologies if I've mispronounced, saying, what is RICS's approach during preparation of rules of conduct? Are they looking for advice from the specific local body institutions of a particular country to understand the local wisdom, common sense?
The answer to that is we have done quite a bit of engagement with the RICS's local bodies across the globe. One of the big challenges, which I mentioned in passing at the beginning, but one of the big challenges for a global body is how do you balance, on the one hand, the fact that you've got surveyors operating in very different cultural and political contexts, against the fact that a profession does have certain standards that it nails its colours to the mast on. And so, you know, there may be some examples of countries where some of these rules provide a challenge to surveyors in practice. You know, there may even be some firms, very aggressive commercial firms, where some of these rules create a personal challenge. What we've tried to do is assert what we consider to be the absolute fundamentals. You know, we're not going to accept discriminatory behaviour just because someone is working in a firm where discriminatory behaviour is permitted. You know, and as a professional, ultimately you have a duty which goes beyond simply complying with whatever orders you're given with by a firm. There may be extreme circumstances in which people simply cannot practice in accordance with the rules in a particular set of circumstances, and they have to walk away. Now, we're trying to be as flexible as possible within an overall ethical framework. We have very specifically asked in this consultation for examples of areas where there may be genuine difficulties with compliance. And in the end, when we got all the responses from the consultation back, we will see what we can do to accommodate local difference without compromising the fundamental standards. But that's not entirely easy, and getting that balance right, you know, we can't pretend is going to be completely easy.
Thank you very much. We've got 2 minutes to go. I just want to use those 2 minutes to offer my huge thanks to all of our panelists today for taking the time to be with us and to addressing those questions that we did get to. I'm sorry, I do know that there were some that we didn't manage to get to, and if we can give you feedback outside the meeting, we can. The last thing I'd like to say is, if everybody listening could please go and go to the website, take part in the consultation. It would be a huge benefit to our RICS to hear your thoughts. Even if all you want to say is that you like the document and you would like it to come into force, that's a really helpful thing for us to know as well. Obviously, what we usually get are the comments telling us what you don't like. So if you do like something, please tell us as well, and that will make it less likely it'll be changed. Equally, if people would like to email me with comments or questions, please do that. I'm very happy to hear from people and carry on conversations outside this. As Antony said at the beginning, you know, this is a dialogue. This isn't we've made decisions and we're, you know, this is rubber stamping. We really want to hear what people think because we want to get this right. So I'd like to finish by thanking Dayle, Antony and Bola for joining us, and thanking all of you for coming along, and hopefully you found it useful.
Thanks a lot. Take care, everyone.